So let's go ahead and get started with the decline and fall and possible resurrection of the American chestnut. The American chestnut is a functionally extinct tree that used to be a linchpin species of North American eastern seaboard, with a natural range that extended from southern Ontario to Florida. The economic and ecological importance of this species cannot be overstated, both in terms of its value to humans and forest ecology. So its ultimate demise due to introduced pathogens was a tragic tale for the impoverished hill people who depended upon this iconic tree for their livelihood.
Hey,
Although
Tom,
the species has been,
Tom,
hello.
I'm still seeing your first slide. Do you think you're moving through?
Yep, that's where we should.
Okay, sorry, because I knew you had a slide about that.
Nope, not.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. All right, keep going.
No, totally fine. Okay, so its ultimate demise due to introduced pathogens was a tragic blow for the impoverished hill people who on the iconic tree for their livelihood. Although the species has been functionally extinct for a century, all is not yet lost, and steady progress continues toward the future. Cautiously optimistic when the American chestnut can, perhaps, return to the prominent role in the forests of Appalachia. So there are 5 species of chestnut trees in the world. 3 are from Asia, 1 from North America, and 1 from Europe. The generic name, Castanea, stems from the latter, the European chestnut, where it has been cultivated for at least 2 millennia. And the genus name originated from an ancient village in modern-day Turkey with the name of Castanea, which was then Latin with a C, and then anglicized to Chesson or chestnut, and eventually concatenated to chestnut. All 5 chestnut species, along with the closely related shrubs that are named chinkapin, produce edible nuts and are important food and forage crops throughout recorded history. The species epithet for the American chestnut, dentata, refers to that sharply toothed leaf margin that you see there. So the word chestnut is very common in English, and it's misapplied to several other unrelated plants. The horse chestnut here is a European species which produces a toxic, although consuming animals like squirrels and deer and pigs seem unaffected. It's a common landscape tree because it's very pollution tolerant, and it is. There are also several native species of horse chestnut that exist too, which are collectively called buckeyes, because the nuts were said to look similar to a white-tailed deer's eye. Again, not a chestnut. And while we all love our Chinese takeout, those crunchy little nuggets that you find in your Kung Pao chicken, water chestnut, corn, typical Asian say. Again, not a chestnut. Chestnut is a very similar leaf shape to the American chestnut, hence the name, and it thrives in pool and especially on ridgeline, hence the name rock oak, as you can see in the photo. It has very thick bark, which protects it from fire, and again, not a chestnut. The Brazil nut, which is also sometimes known as the Brazil chestnut, is having a moment of popularity now because of its high levels of antioxidants, especially selenium, which is good for your thyroid. And again, not a chestnut. I mentioned chinkapins. These are a shrub-like relative of the American chestnut, and there are at least 2 species, both of which are also susceptible to chestnut blight. And although it's related, still not a chestnut. And a few other chestnuts to consider. So as a modern language artifact of this iconic tree's former importance, you often find chestnut as a descriptor for other objects, such as this fetching lady in the lower right. That is, she has chestnut colored hair. And right above it, that visually appealing horse, that's called a chestnut mare. Jumping over to the other side, you see those happy little chestnut-backed chickadees. And right below it, that is something I probably don't even need to say. That is the chestnut bolete. Also pretty good edible, Gyroporus castaneus. Castaneus means chestnut. And a cultural language artifact in Britain, an old worn out joke is called a chestnut or an old chestnut. And since we're across the pond, I thought I'd stay over there and show, just for kicks, a photo of the Tortworth chestnut right here in the center. Now, this would be the European chestnut species, not the American chestnut, but nonetheless, it is impressively old. It's called the Tortworth chestnut, and it is the oldest tree in the United Kingdom. But nobody is really quite sure just how old it is. There's documentation in this tree all the way back. Some claims place it as early as 800 modern era, which those are just really nuts. So I'm going to try to that in a different paradigm, and that gives me an opportunity to come up on my soapbox about conservation. This is something that you're going to hear more from me and us in 24. So consider yourself warned. That's a chestnut tree that was born in the midst of the Dark Ages. Of Normandy would cross the Channel and defeat all others in 1066 in the Battle of Hastings to become William the Conqueror. And this tree was nothing but a teenage at that time. It had witnessed the Renaissance, the Baroque, Modernism, Neoclassical, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Cubism, Fauvism, Dada, Art Nouveau, Abstract Expressionism, and every other type of ism. It has witnessed the Tudor era, the Elizabethan era, the Georgian era, the Victorian era, and the Edwardian era. It's witnessed the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the Age of Steam, and the Atomic Age. If you don't care about old growth forests, if you don't care about conservation, well, you should, because old growth forests are patrimony, and the only opportunity to bequeath a millennia of heritage to the next generation. Okay, moving on. Thank you. Okay, so during the last Pleistocene ice age, this is greater than 10,000, chestnut tree was nearly driven to extinction. As ice sheets advanced across the continent, its natural range along the eastern seaboard became uninhabitable, and the tree clung to a meager existence all the way down here in coastal Florida. But as the glaciers receded and the climate warmed, the tree quickly repopulated range the birds such as blue jays and passenger pigeons, who rapidly transported the nuts across great distances, while nut-foraging animals such as squirrels filled in the gaps. When humans migrated to the Americas at the end of the Ice Age, they too helped to repopulate the species, but not by directly cultivating it. You see, chestnuts belong to the beech family, along with the oaks, and like most trees in this family, they prefer well-drained upland soils. And while they can exist to a lesser extent in other habitats, their abundance across their native range has likely been exaggerated, likely been greatly exaggerated. They were common, however, and in their preferred upland habitat, it's estimated that they could have made up to 25% of the forest. Now, pre-Columbian peoples, indigenous peoples, indirectly helped to augment that percentage by using fire to manage forest ecology. Mature American chestnuts have very thick bark, which allows them to survive forest fires. So after a controlled burn, they would have been unaffected and increased their population base by germinating new saplings in the now barren soil of less fire-tolerant trees. The American chestnut, so we begin to decline now. The American chestnut was immediately recognized during colonization as a very important foodstuff. Captain John Smith wrote about it in his papers, and its total population was largely unaffected for the very first century afterwards. While the wood was harvested for construction material, it was also widely cultivated too, so the nuts could be preserved as a wintertime source of calories. As population increased, though, chestnut numbers started to slowly decline as it was timbered for lumber and to feed the many iron furnaces that were dotted along the eastern seaboard, beginning in the mid 1600s. Iron furnaces use enormous amounts of charcoal, like this one here at Catoctin Furnace, Maryland, which this one in particular, it consumed on average 1 acre a day of trees during its 119 years of active service. The American chestnut, continuing the decline, the American chestnut is much larger than the other chestnut trees, and it has a mature height of about 100 feet, but its girth is so impressive, as you can see in this photo here. While the Asian chestnut trees, they rarely exceed 30 feet in height. As the population along the eastern seaboard relied less on its nuts for food, it was harvested instead for its lumber. And here's a church over in Raynell, West Virginia, which was made exclusively out of chestnut wood. And you can visit it today. And I mean, just look at that thing. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? And but because chestnut wood is very rot resistant and straight grained, it was far more desirable to use this lumber to make things that are exposed to the elements, like railroad ties or shingles, and especially split rail fences. Up until the invention of barbed wire in 1867, the chestnut split rail fence was ubiquitous because it would just last longer than any other type of wood. And just think for a second, how many chestnut trees had to be felled in order to make that split rail fence? So further contributing to the decline was the tannic acid rich bark that's found in chestnut trees, and it used to be used to tan leather. Tannic acid was used to tan leather. That's where that word. And you can see in this wonderful etching down here, the woodsman would use specialized tools to strip the bark off the trees. Yet, despite the overharvesting for charcoal for the iron furnaces and lumber and tannin, the chestnut's overall numbers remained really strong until the introduction of a pathogen, but not that pathogen, not the one you're thinking of, at least not yet. Okay, so although the chestnut population was in decline, it remained common and its reputation as a cultural icon continued to grow through the mid-19th century. Nearly every town has a street named Chestnut, I think. Even my little piece of nothing town in central Pennsylvania, as you can see in the photo down here in the lower right. And as can be witnessed in these fantastic Winslow Homer etchings and watercolors, foraging for chestnuts remained an activity for white, poverty-stricken Appalachian hill people, aka hillbillies, both to supplement their food stores and their. Many of the chestnuts that they collected would go on to become roasted chestnuts in East Coast cities, which were a popular street vendor food at the time. The American chestnut is a really heavy nut producer, and every year they don't have masting years like other trees. So a nut crop could be depended on each autumn to supplement the poor hill people's larder, their wallet, feed the game that they hunted, and fatten up their livestock. Farmers would drive their pigs to the ridge lines where the chestnut trees thrived to dine on fallen nuts in the autumn. And the most famous ridge line of all is called Chestnut Ridge, which is the westernmost ridge in the Valley and Ridge province that extends from central Pennsylvania all the way down through West Virginia. And if you've ever been to Sequanota, you've driven over it. The loss of this tree, the chestnut tree, would most impact the rural, white, poverty-stricken Scotch-Irish found in Appalachia, and it would impact them enormously. Okay, the decline, part 3. Water molds are microscopic protist organisms. Well, now they're considered protists. They used to be part of kingdom fungi for a while. And they are often notorious pathogens. A water mold is what caused the Irish potato famine. You see an example of it over here. And another, Phytophthora cinnamomi, is fatal to many species of trees, including the European and American chestnut. It's called ink disease because it attacks the root, this dark blue, black liquid that you see here. It is a slow growing pathogen that was introduced to Europe from India in the late 18th century, where it had and continues to have a devastating effect on the chestnut orchards in Iberia, France, and Italy. And from there, it was moved to the southeastern United States in the mid-19th century. Since it prefers moist soil of warmer climates, it slowly advanced across the southeastern seaboard, devastating the chestnut population in coastal regions and bottomlands. Ink disease is also fatal to avocados, azaleas, Fraser firs, and pines too. And it still very much exists, and it has a global distribution. It's one of the worst invasive species, and its range is increasing thanks to global warming. Now, on that cheerful note, the fall. Okay, so while the Asian chestnut tree is small compared to the American chestnut, its nuts, as you can see in this photo, are more than double the size. So it's obvious, while it was imported in 1876. If only we knew then what we know now. The Asian chestnut was carrying the microfungi that would drive our beloved species into extinction. Cryphonectria parasitica, or chestnut blight, spores are wind dispersed. And if they land on the bark of a chestnut tree, or more correctly, a crack in the bark where they have access to the cambium, like here, well, then it's game over. The blight will girdle the tree, killing the vascular tissue around the circumference of the initial infection, and ultimately kill the tree too. Well, more correctly, the tree is only mostly dead, like in The Princess Bride. And since the blight cannot survive in the soil, the chestnut tree will continue to send up new shoots from its root ball. but these saplings will become infected and die before they reach full maturity. The fungus also infects red oaks, especially the DC state tree. I think it's okay to call it a state tree for DC in this context, which is the scarlet oak. So its spores remain very widely distributed. Scarlet oaks have a flared base, you can see in this photo down here, which is the result of them fighting off the chestnut blight. By 1940, the blight had reached every corner of the native range. Government funding to stop its spread had dried up, and the species became functionally extinct. Yet, we remember. Returning the chestnut to its native range has been the holy grail of resurrection projects for more than a century, with both government and private organizations helping move us towards the goal of finding a blight-resistant American chestnut. And, turn of phrase, it has been a tough nut to crack. Since all chestnut species readily hybridize, most of that effort has focused on crossbreeding in the hope that one day we can find a blight-resistant offspring of large size. Recall, the American tree is about 3 times taller than the Asian species. The USDA initiated crossbreeding work back in 1922 with very little success, but by the 1960s, the funding ran out. And then private organizations like the American Chestnut Foundation here picked up the torch and produced ever more viable offspring thanks to improving science and techniques. But this work is very time consuming because it takes 7 years for a tree to produce nuts and another 5 before the sapling can be tested for blight resistance. Thus, it takes 12 years to figure out whether or not you had any success. Still, though, it holds a lot of promise, and one of those successes is an American Chinese hybrid called the Dunstan chestnut down here, which you can go buy at Walmart or Home Depot if you so desire. Alternatively, other research to resurrect the American chestnut is focused on transgenics, or altering the genetic code directly. Now, when they first started doing this back in the 1940s, they did it very crudely, and they just took chestnut seeds and blasted them with gamma and neutron radiation in the lab, in the hope that they would introduce some randomly introduced genetic mutation that would be blight resistance. Of course, it never was. And by the mid-60s, those transgenic experiments were abandoned. Well, at least for a while, because by the time we get to the 1990s, researchers had discovered that the chestnut blight fungus secreted oxalic acid, which it used to break down the tree's vascular tissue. And subsequently, of all things, they went and located a gene in wheatgrass that catalyzes that oxalic acid, creates an enzyme to render the oxalic acid neutral. Thus, when they spliced that gene into the chestnut tree's genetic code using CRISPR, it made the blight harmless. Better living through genetically modified organisms. Another potential solution may lie with hypovirulence, which is a $10 way of saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in this case, the enemy of my enemy is a virus. You can see in the lower left, there's a poem by the great Robert Frost, all the way back in 1936, which is kind of apt for talking about hypovirulence. The name of the poem is Evil Tendencies Cancel. So will the blight end a chestnut? The farmers rather guess not. It keeps smoldering at the roots and sending up new shoots till another parasite shall come to end the blight. We now know that a fungal virus protected the European chestnut from the blight and subsequent extinction, like our own American chestnut. And I have to wonder if this virus will have a role to play in saving our American chestnut on this continent as well. Now, what is ultimately going to work? The crossbreeding done by the American Chestnut Foundation, or modifying genetic code, CRISPR, or the hypo, or something else. It's all still too early to say which of these solutions are viable, but I do know this. The desire to return the American chestnut to its rightful place in East Coast forests has never worked. And when you couple human ingenuity with human technology and human creativity, I'm going to wager on us. And I'd wager we'll soon be writing a new chapter in the history of this continent's most valuable plant. A classic mythology tale where the hero rises up again to claim the day. So that's all I have about the American chestnut. I'll take some questions and answers now. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun for me. Turn my video on for a moment. Okay, I'm going to leave the presentation up because I have a couple slides afterwards to talk about, well, if anybody wants to know how to cook these things up. Okay.
Folks have questions? I'm just getting lots of cheering in the in the comments. And some of us were enjoying the cricket noises.
Oh, it's this was such a bad idea to try to do a presentation work while you're on travel. But you know, you're dealing with a lot of variables. Okay, so in lieu of any questions, I had a couple slides that I did on the back end of this because I thought somebody would ask me, you know, how do you cook these things up? You know, what's the appeal of chestnuts? They seem to be increasing in popularity. So I'll just kind of quickly go over some culinary tips for them. So first thing is kind of share some, at least this is how I process chestnuts. First thing you have to do is these chestnut trees, they're covered in a very spiny layer on the outside. So first thing you want to do is go get yourself a thick pair of gloves, and so you can tear that apart, the chestnut nuts on the inside. Believe it or not, this part of this station. Once you have the nuts extracted, the seed coat. The outer one is very leathery, not too hard to get rid of. But the inner one, that's like a paper thin glued meat. And what you want to do, or large gloves used to fillet fish, and you take the individual chestnuts and you have to cut an X in the side of them all the way down into the nut meat. And then you want to put them into simmering water for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes to make sure that they're well hydrated. And then when you yank them out of there, you try to peel them at that stage. But what I usually do is I put them into the air fryer for, I don't know, 5 minutes or so to dry them out. You're basically making roasted chestnuts at that point. And that seems to me to have the most success of peeling chestnuts, wildly harvested chestnuts. Honestly, this is a ton of work. And what I do more often is I go to the Asian grocery store and you can buy bags of already peeled whole chestnuts for usually $2 or less. So that's what I tend to do instead of doing. You're going to spend all afternoon peeling chestnuts. Go this other route. The other thing about chestnuts, what makes them kind of unique amongst nuts, is nuts generally tend to have a lot of protein and fat, and the other macro nutrient carbohydrates tend to be a lot less. But with chestnuts, it's flipped around. Chestnuts have just meager amounts of protein and fat, but they have a lot of carbohydrates in them. But unlike, so they're more like a grain or a fruit than they are a nut, at least in their macronutrient profile. But they are very rich in the micronutrients. They have a ton of antioxidants in them, and they also have a lot of manganese and potassium. So they have a really nice micronutrient. Given that they're mostly carbohydrates, one of the things that they were classically done is they just dry them out and they'd mill them into a chestnut flour. And there's you can buy this stuff on Amazon if you so desire. And then once you have it into a flour, you can turn it into all kinds of stuff like chestnut pasta, or here's chestnut gnocchi, and over here is chestnut polenta. And if you don't feel like playing around or don't have any of the chestnut flour, a couple of other savory options are Brussels sprouts and chestnuts are a classic combination. And of course, chestnut stock, another great savory option. Oh, one other thing too makes for the comeback of the American chestnut is the American chestnut was known to have two macrofungi associated with it very often. One was chicken mushroom. So, good edible chicken mushrooms were often found on chestnut trees. The other one, which is probably my favorite edible mushroom, the beefsteak polypore, Fistulina hepatica, that was so common on chestnut trees that they used to refer to it as chestnut tongue. So those are some savory options. Spend a couple minute or two talking about some sweet options. I would recommend these two products to anybody. This is a sweetened chestnut puree. This one here, châtaignes, that's how you say chestnut in French. And you just use these like a spread. They are, I think they're really delicious. So I'd recommend those to anybody. And also, there's some old recipes that are kind of making a comeback right now that have Nesselrode in the name. Nesselrode pudding, Nesselrode ice cream, and Nesselrode pie. Now, these all stem from a Russian diplomat by the name of Count Karl von Nesselrode. He used to run foreign policy for several decades during the first half of the 1800s for the Russian government. And Count Karl just loved chestnuts. So his chef invented a couple of recipes that in honor of his boss. And a couple of the ingredients that you always find in recipes that are called Nesselrode is they will have this chestnut puree, and they have those glacéed fruits that you find in like fruitcake, and a very nice shot of rum as well. So how bad can that be? And last slide. This is a couple of other classic chestnut desserts that you find in Europe. Over here on the right-hand side, this is Castagnaccio. This is if you're familiar with flourless chocolate cake, this is kind of a version of that made with chestnut flour that's made in Italy, and it's just covered with pine nuts. And then over here in the upper left-hand corner, these are candied chestnuts. They are called marron glace. You can find these online, but I warn you, my God, are they expensive. But they are really good, so might be worth giving it a try one time. And down here in the bottom left, this is one of my absolute favorite desserts of all time. I just think this is a wonderful dish. This is called Mont Blanc. And that's a sweetened chestnut puree on the bottom and whipped cream on top. And it's said that it looks like Mont Blanc, which I believe is the highest peak in Europe. That's part of the Alps that separates France from Italy. And that whipped cream is said to look like those snow-covered peaks. So it's
all right. So the culinary part of this presentation has lit up the chat. And Alan Perper says he used to get chestnuts on the streets of New York City in the 50s and 60s. I assume roasted from street vendors. And do we think those would have been European chestnuts that people were importing?
They were a mix. but a lot of the chestnuts that were sold on East Coast cities came from Europe. But a lot of them came from Appalachia too. Whenever I was talking about how that basically supported the poor, the hill people, the hillbillies' wallets, they would go out and collect chestnuts and then sell them to a vendor, and that vendor would sell them, have them shipped to East Coast cities where they would be sold again 2 or 3 more times before they ended up as roasted chestnuts on the streets of Philadelphia and New York, etc.
Yeah. And Johnny wanted to know, so you had a picture of chestnut flour on one of your slides. Do you know, is there anywhere locally you can get it? Do you have to order it?
I don't know. I always buy mine off of Amazon, the great marketplace. So I know you can get it there.
Catherine has
I don't know of any place
from France recently. She's got that chestnut puree. Yum. And Stephen Prada is saying that chestnut beer is common in northern Italy during chestnut season. And there's
okay. I know about that one.
So fun stuff. Money wants to know, were there descriptions on what the American chestnut tasted like compared to maybe the other chestnuts?
It is considered to be a sweeter nut, but as you saw in the one slide, it's less than half the size of the Asian chestnut. So you have to do a lot more work to get, a similar volume.
And then Katrine's asking, the European chestnuts, you said they also get the blight, but is it that the virus keeps it in check so it doesn't really affect the trees as much?
That's the working theory. The European chestnut just lucked out because there's a virus that attacks the blight that just allows the European chestnut to survive.
So does it seem to be a stable population there? They're not
define stable. I don't think anything's stable with changing climates, etc. But there's still a lot of chestnuts in Europe, so it's relatively stable. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Steven says that Moms has chestnut products, and Annie Weissman says Balducci's has a ton of chestnut products, but they're expensive. Definitely local options. Oh, Elizabeth Axley's asking, do we know, is the chestnut bolete named because of its color, or did it possibly also have a mycorrhizal relationship with chestnut?
I don't know for certain. I would say it's only the color, but I mean,
it's an interesting.
I have no idea what fungi were had mycorrhizal relationships with chestnut trees.
I mean, that is a really interesting question to me. We didn't have the kind of community science that we do now, where you'd be able to see the change, but like, it must have changed the whole landscape of the mushrooms in the forest to lose.
Well, I think this is
a tree. Although they are there, right? Their roots have persisted. They send up suckers sometimes.
Yeah, I think this is one of those great open kind of questions regarding reintroducing genetically modified trees into the wilderness. We don't know, what kind of mycorrhizal relationships these genetically modified chestnut trees are going to have. Yeah. And, we're at a point, in the next couple of years, you're going to see some mass planting chestnut. So time will tell.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's quite for me.
And hopefully there's been enough of a reservoir in the trees that have, been limping along this whole time that there'll be some mushrooms that are able to re-emerge. Chris Wozniak's raising his hand. Why don't you jump in, Chris?
Oh, good. See, I know he's done a lot of work on chestnut trees.
Oh, good.
I was hoping to hear.
You there, Chris? You're muted if you're talking.
Yeah, you're muted, Chris.
Still don't hear you. I see that you're unmuted and I do not hear Chris Wozniak.
That's a bummer. Well,
we'll figure it out.
hope you work those technical problems out, Chris. I was really looking forward to hearing what you said. I know you've done a lot of work with chestnut trees at the EPA before.
Oh, and Annie just posted a mushroom in the chat that the specific name is castaneus, so presumably because it was associated. And Tom Moore is posting a couple of New York Times articles about the American chestnut, so you can look in the chat for those links too.
Oh man, I should be getting some with all this enthusiasm for chestnuts. I should be getting some kickbacks from the local chestnut vendors. I think we're going to have a run on chestnut products for the holidays.
Yeah. Well, this was great. Should we switch over to DNA now?
Elizabeth, Chris Wozniak has his hand up.
Yeah, he unmuted and then we still didn't hear him. We can try one more.
Okay.
You there, Chris?
Hello.
Hey! Yay. Tell us.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fine. I don't know what's going on with this computer. But anyway, I just wanted to say that during the review, which is ongoing at EPA, there was a request of Bill Powell's group at SUNY Syracuse to provide some evidence on any impacts on potential mycorrhizal associations. And that data was provided, and there was not a direct impact on any of the fungi. Remember that this is a necrotrophic fungus that's secreting oxalic acid, and so the wheat gene, the oxalic oxidase, is merely breaking down that acid. It's not a direct, on fungus toxin type approach or anything like that. So that information was provided. And on a sad note, I don't know if any of you ever knew Bill. Bill just passed away about 2 weeks ago. So his right-hand man, Andy Newhouse, has taken over the project at Syracuse. And we're still hopeful that things move through APHIS, USDA APHIS, and through EPA in a timely manner, although it's been going on for close to 8 or 9 years already.
Do you have any predictions on when the Darling 58, which is that genetically modified species, is going to be approved to be distributed into the wild, Chris? Or it hasn't been approved yet, right?
Yeah, not really, because there are 2 layers of regulation here. There's the APHIS, environment, or the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA review, and the Plant Protection Act review, which is closer to finishing than the EPA looking at it under the pesticide statute, which is FIFRA. Now, one of the things that's proposed for the EPA side of things is initially to register this chestnut, the Darling 58, as a PIP, or Plant Incorporated Protected. That typically, in most cases takes a few years minimum. So once that's done, or maybe simultaneously, part of the group at the EPA will also be working on an exemption from the requirement of oversight under FIFRA. And what that all means in layman's speak is that they want to, prove it safe, register it, and then exempt it. No PIP to date has ever been exempted like that. So to try and predict how long that will take is anybody's guess. My feeling is that a scientific advisory panel under FIFRA will have to be called, and 10, 12, 15 scientists will sit down for a few days and hammer out, based on the questions the agency provides, what is the best move forward. I was at an entomological meeting a few weeks ago, and one of the industry people told me that one of the hangups on this in part could be the fact that they're using a wheat gene, which is one of the notifiable allergens under FDA's oversight, such that you'll have to either have a clause that these will not be for commercial production. They'll be, out in the forest, whether that's National Park Service, USDA Forest Service land, or private land, but they would not enter into commercial production until that issue is dealt with.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was so insightful. And please feel free to send me an email of all the things that I got wrong in my presentation.
No, it was good. Thank you very much.